Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Andidiong Okon, and I am the Community and Capacity Building Manager at Open Contracting Partnership. Today, we're going to be talking about using OCDS extensions, and this webinar in particular is targeted at people that are already implementing OCDS or publishing OCDS and want to know how they can use extensions to improve the data that they are publishing using OCDS. And these are the objectives of today's webinar. We want to understand why OCDS has an extensions mechanism and why it is important. And we also want to understand how and where to find existing extensions and modeling discussions. Finally, the third objective of today's webinar is to understand how to declare and use extensions and how OCDS tooling treats this use of extensions. So thank you all for joining today. At this point, I would like to introduce my colleague, Matt Marshall, who is going to be guiding us through today's session. Over to you, Matt.
Hey, thanks, Andy. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen now. So everyone should be able to see this slide. Am I right? Fantastic. Okay, so just building off of what Andy said, today's webinar is all about OCDS extensions, sort of why we have them, what they are, and how to use them. And with this in mind, we've designed this seminar for people who have a little bit of technical knowledge, but you absolutely don't need to be a developer or a wizard with JSON to understand it. If you have basic or intermediate knowledge of the OCDS schema, or if you're an existing OCDS publisher, or if you're comfortable adding or editing lines in a JSON file, this will see you okay throughout this webinar. And if anyone is sitting there thinking, oh no, Matt, I'm a bit non-technical, don't worry, there are still key lessons here for you in this webinar, and you can pass these on to your technical team as well. So we're going to distribute the slides, and we'll have the notes doc where we answer further questions, and we're all in this together, and the OCDS help desk is there to support you. So don't worry, although the people with a little bit of technical knowledge will get the most out of this webinar. It is absolutely for everybody who's involved in the OCDS community. So like Andy said, our aim today is to give you an overview of how to find and use OCDS extensions. So just to quickly put up the aims and objectives that Andy went through before, we want you to know why OCDS has an extensions mechanism and why this is important. We want you to know how to find existing OCDS extensions and where they are hiding on the web, and then how to declare them in your OCDS publications so that you can actually begin using them. And to achieve this, we're going to aim for a length of around half an hour for this slideshow and then the demonstrations. We might underrun, we might overrun. We've given ourselves quite a lot of leeway there. And if we finish early, that just means more time for juicy questions and answers at the end. So first up, we're going to do an introduction to extensions. Then we're going to turn to the pragmatic, and we're going to discover how to find them. And then we're going to show you a practical demonstration of implementing a simple extension. So without further ado, let's take a dive into what an OCDS extension is and why we have them. Any discussion of an OCDS extension ultimately goes back to mapping. And if you've not engaged with us particularly deeply before, then mapping is the process of identifying the data elements in your data, in your source systems and your source information that map to particular fields in OCDS. So that'll be to fields and in particular codes in the OCDS code lists. Some data that you have might not match a field or a code in the core OCDS schema. So to cover these cases, you can use extensions to basically add these extra fields and extra codes to OCDS in a standardized way, in a way that's accessible for users. So what extensions ultimately do is they provide a way to make sure that these additions are documented, and they also define additional validation rules for them. And what this means for you is that when you're populating these fields and when you're producing your data for publication, it ensures that you're populating them correctly, and it declares them automatically available for data users and tools to make use of. And we'll see an example of this later on. So effectively, what extensions allow you to do is to capture the widest scope of data that's in your source system that you can, and declare it in a standardized way using OCDS principles, and in a way that makes it declares it available for additional for use by data users and by the tools that they're using for analysis. And since we're presuming you're familiar with the OCDS basics, I'll be a little bit quicker in this section than I would normally be. But strictly speaking, the only thing that can be called OCDS is a JSON document that validates against the official OCDS schema. The schema and its code lists define the structure, the format, and the semantics, which is to say the meanings of the various fields in OCDS and the various codes in its code lists. One thing that the schema does is it provides a human readable title and a description for each field and code. And this helps humans interpret the meanings for each field within the schema. So if you're a publisher or you're a technical team and you're on our standard documentation, you will see a table very much like this, which describes the title of the field and then a description of it to allow you to interpret it and perform that mapping from your own source systems. And if you're a data analyst or a journalist who's looking at this data, then it allows you to sort of determine what the semantics of a field is and allows you to guide your analysis appropriately. And it also defines how to structure the data. And it basically says how each field should be structured and formatted. It defines which fields are mandatory in the standard and which are more flexible. And this helps machines to validate the data and to determine whether your data conforms to the OCDS standard. And it also helps humans analyze the data to gain insight from it. So to give an example, the way that parties are represented in OCDS is in a very particular way, with a parties array and then references to each party throughout the schema. And what the schema does by defining those structures is it helps a data user or a journalist analyze or understand what those structures are, and therefore what their analysis should look like, and helps them construct the queries and helps them construct the visualizations that basically make use of the OCDS data and allow us to achieve the impact that we're wanting to see. As I mentioned, the schema is ultimately what defines OCDS data. It reduces ambiguity around details such as formatting, and it enforces rules to accomplish this. In the example that I've put up on the slides, the schema is enforcing a particular rule about date formatting for an amendment object. So this data has put the year in a particular format, and it doesn't quite match with the format that OCDS is expecting. So our validation tool, the data review tool, which we'll see in a little bit, that has flagged that as an error, meaning that this is technically not valid OCDS data. And I want you to keep in mind that this validation step is quite an important step as we go into exploring OCDS extensions. Some schemas and some schema fields refer to code lists to limit and standardize the possible values of fields. And what this does is it allows us to promote data interoperability, and it allows common concepts that are present in most procurement environments to be covered across international boundaries through OCDS. This greatly improves the efficacy of the OCDS in achieving its aims for value for money, for reducing corruption, etc. For example, in your context, an award might be listed as waiting, or awaiting confirmation, or with the review board, or something like this, which makes sense in your language, in your procurement context. But the OCDS code list and code that matches it that matches this concept is the word pending, and that's what should be used in this instance. So really the job there was to map this concept that you have in your procurement environment to the language used in OCDS. And this prevents OCDS from becoming normative. We don't want to change your language. We just want to, and your procurement, we just want to represent it in a way that is standardized and accessible internationally. Code lists themselves can either be open or closed. A closed code list is intended to be comprehensive. So if you take, for example, the currency code list in OCDS, it covers all of the currencies in the world. Open code lists are intended to be representative, but not comprehensive. So how does this look in practice? A publisher must use the code in a code list unless no code is appropriate. If no code is appropriate and the code list is open, then a publisher may use a new code outside of that in the code list, and that's what we mean by open. If we haven't covered it in the OCDS schema, then you can just insert a new code and it will still be valid. However, if it's a closed code list and you've not found an appropriate code that maps to your concept, then what we do is we encourage you to create an issue in the OCDS GitHub repository about adding a new code, because that is a standard development issue, and when we need to take that into account when developing new versions of the standard. And we do that collaboratively and openly via GitHub. And I think we also have a recording of our OCDS GitHub webinar available online as well. I'm sure that we'll link to that in the call notes. So all of this is building up to what extensions do. They interact with the schema, and they do this by sort of adding things and sort of increasing validation rules and increasing the scope of what is covered in the OCDS schema for your particular context in a flexible way. However, there are things that extensions cannot do. So just to give some examples, an extension can introduce new fields, and it can introduce new objects, and it can introduce new sections to the schema. But what it cannot do is change the description or change the semantics of existing fields, of existing objects, and existing sections. Similarly, it can add new codes to open code lists. So rather than have the code not be declared, but in use, you can use an extension to declare the code in a standardized way. But you cannot add codes to a closed code list because, as I've just said, that is a standard development issue, and closed code lists are controlled quite tightly in the OCDS schema. An extension can introduce new validation rules to new and existing fields, but you cannot remove existing validation rules on fields, and you cannot remove existing fields from being mandatory. Sorry, folks, but you can't remove the obligation to publish an OCID, because that's the backbone of OCDS. And building from this, there are 3 types of extension that you should be aware of. There are recommended extensions, and these are maintained as part of the standard governance process. So as OCDS is governed, the recommended extensions are governed along with it. These are documented as part of the standard. These are reviewed by the OCDS technical team every time we do a version upgrade of OCDS. And these are likely to be relevant to a large number of publishers and users. In fact, we encourage all users of OCDS and all publishers to consider whether a recommended extension should be used with their data. And if you lack the data needed to make use of a recommended extension, we actually ask publishers to consider whether this data can be collected in the future. And this is part of the transparency cycle and positive change that OCDS is trying to enable. Like, once we've got the data from the core schema, we should be broadening our vision to accommodate more use cases, make better use of the data, and that at the moment includes evaluating whether you should be using a recommended extension. Slightly narrower in scope are the community extensions, and these are maintained by third parties and are, in a very few cases, might be maintained by the OCDS team, but in those cases we maintain them outside of the standard governance process. These extensions may provide fields that are, or codes that are required only by a small number of publishers or users, but are still transferable across different contexts. One common use case is to document a publisher or a group of publishers' set of additional fields or codeless values. Even narrower are local extensions, and I've really just included these for completeness and potentially as a warning in case you come across one of them online. So local extensions are used only by one or a very small number of publishers. And the reason for this is that they are usually very specific to that context and very hyper-local to that data. For this reason, they are not listed in the extensions registry. So they can't be found through conventional means on OCDS sites. So an example for this would be if a publisher has a very specific procurement concept in their country, an implementer might implement an OCDS extension that is very specific to that local government or that state government or that national government that isn't really applicable anywhere else. And for that reason, they're the ones who control it, and they're the ones who version it, and we support them with that, but it's not as applicable to the broader community as a community extension, and certainly not as a recommended extension. So how do you determine whether you need to use an OCDS extension? You do this essentially by engaging with the OCDS field level mapping process. This is supported by our field level mapping template, which is available on the Open Contracting Resources page. You first identify data which maps to the core OCDS schema. This is because you don't really need to think about extensions here. We're just thinking about the core OCDS and what your data looks like. Once you've got those mappings down, you should take a look at your data and see if there's any fields left over which haven't mapped to the OCDS core schema. And you should see which of those map to fields in a recommended extension and determine how to use that by finding that recommended extension on the Extensions Explorer. The recommended extensions are actually present in the field level mapping template, so you don't need to keep these in your mind at the time. You'll be prompted to think about them if you use the OCDS field level mapping template. Finally, if you've got data that doesn't map to either of those, so neither a recommended extension nor the core OCDS schema, you should use the Extensions Explorer to discover other extensions that may apply. And we'll introduce the Extensions Explorer in the next section to support this. If you have data that doesn't map to existing fields or an existing extension and you can't find it in the Extensions Explorer, then you should get in touch with the OCDS help desk at data@opencontracting.org, and we'll support you with what to do going forward, because that might require one of a few things, and we don't want to overload this webinar with information. So the best thing to do is, if none of the above apply to you, is just get in touch with us. We're always happy to help. So using extensions to disclose extra data means that your OCDS data users don't miss out on any of the data in your source system. It means that nothing is lost when publishing your data as OCDS, and it means that the fields that you do insert are declared appropriately. It means that your data is consistent with that of other publishers who use similar concepts. And that means that data users and journalists and civil society and even your own governments can understand how to interpret it and make the best use of it. The validation rules that extensions bring also mean that you can check the validity of your data during the testing and development phases of your OCDS publication, and ensure that you get the highest quality data published out there. And then subsequently, users and tools can process and present the data properly to see the impact that you want in your local context. So how do we find OCDS extensions? It's time for a demonstration now. So I believe I've shared with you my whole window, and it's easy to determine which extensions are recommended in the Extensions Explorer because they have the recommended tag. So let's see if we can see any examples here. Ooh. Zoom getting in the way of itself there. And the Extensions Explorer is available at extensions.opencontracting.org, and you just hit Browse Extensions, and it comes up with a long list of extensions. And we can see here the recommended ones are clearly marked with a recommended tag. So let's have a look at the anatomy of an extension. So once you've clicked in, it sort of brings up this page about the extension, and each extension has a list along the side of the different sections. So the first here that we're in is documentation. Extensions will vary in the sort of level of detail that they have in the documentation, but recommended extensions will often have a very high level of detail to make it very clear how they're supposed to be used. Extensions should document what changes to the schema that they make, as well as giving examples of the new data structures that they add in action. So let's have a look at the schema for the bid statistics and details extension. We can see that they've added a bids field to the release object. For awards, we can see that they've had related bids. They've added bid statistics is a new object or concept. And then we have a bids object, which has a statistic, which makes use of all these fields here. And you can see, as before, when we talked about the schema, each of these fields has a title and description as defined by the schema. So you should be able to use this documentation in order to understand how these fields should be used and what information that they contain. I can also see on this side list that code lists have been added to the schema here. So we have a bid statistics code list, which I presume is being used to determine what type of bid statistic object it is. So we have a valid bid, we have a statistics around the actual bidders, we have statistics around SME bids are accounted for in this code list as well. And we also have a bid status code list. So invited, pending, and valid. So the submitted bid has met the qualification requirements in order to be evaluated. All of this will make sense to you if you are looking to implement bids and the statistics and details around those bids in your OCDS publication. But let's look at some specific examples now. So, for example, my procurements are often divided into lots, and I want to make sure that this information is in my OCDS data. How do we ensure that, that we do this? So the first step, as before, is just to head to the OCDS Extensions Explorer. And then I just use the find function inside of the browser, and I just go lots. And oh, look, here is the lots extension. So we can see here that we have a lots extension. It's quite thoroughly documented. It even has guidance on how the rest of our OCDS data is affected by implementing the lots extension. And it gives us a quite thorough example here for how to implement the lots in the actual data itself. The next question is I need to monitor and disclose data about whether I'm procuring from small, medium or large companies. So let's go to the Extensions Explorer. So that I've broken this question down into some keywords, procuring, and then let's say companies and large. So see if there's anything with procure. So we have some here for procure, contract extensions via supplementary contract. Doesn't look like it is what we want. Guarantees doesn't look like what we want. Let's see what else we have. We have procedure, not really what we want. Procurement method rationale, that might be part of what we want. So let's look at the legal context. It doesn't look like what we want because it doesn't make any mention of SMEs or the size of an organization. So let's search for large. Here we go. We have a party scale extension for classifying organizations as a micro, an SME or large organization. So let's have a quick review of the documentation to make sure it's what we want. I think it might be. So it adds a scale field to the party details object to indicate the size or the scale of an organization. This is exactly what we want. So let's have a look at the guidance. if you can distinguish between the two sizes, you can use the small and medium codes. So I know now that there are some codes that have been added, and I can see an example here. It looks like a very simple extension that declares just one or two fields here inside of the parties array. So let's have a look at the schema. As we suspected, it's quite a simple extension. It just allows us to declare party scale, and it says it's a string from the closed party scale code list. So it's a closed code list, which means that we won't be able to add our own codes to this, which is good because it means that we're using standardized terminology that's applicable internationally. So let's actually have a look at this code list. It defines one code list, the party scale code list, and it allows us to have a look at whether an organization is a micro organization, an SME, a small, a medium, or a large organization separately, or even somebody who is self-employed, which is another way of saying a sole trader. So this looks like the exact thing that we wanted. So how do we actually go about using extensions? This looks a bit technical, but don't worry. It is perfectly straightforward. Extensions are actually declared in the package metadata for releases and records. This involves editing a single line, although I should be transparent, you then need to add in the fields that the extension adds as well. You can't just get away with declaring the extension and have it automatically fill in for you, unfortunately. So time for a demonstration. If you want to use this slide deck yourself later, I've provided some links to some sample data, and you should run it through our data review tool and see how it behaves, and like sort of interrogate it and see what happens when you add fields in without an extension and add the extension without any fields, etc. But I think it might be more useful for you now to see to see this in action. So I'm actually going to change the sharing to my entire window. Let's have a look, see if I can do this. Desktop 1. Cool, so everybody should be able to see my entire desktop and a JSON file here. Is that right? Can everyone see that?
Yes.
I'm going to take silence as golden here. So here is some JSON data, which is OCDS data. We can see from the tender that it is a tender solicited for work to build new cycle lanes in the center of town. And let's actually apply the party scale extension that we just looked at, just to keep this sort of narrative thread going. So let's have a look at our parties. We have the London Borough of Barnet, who is the buyer. We can see that from the buyer roles. And then we also have Cycle Lanes for You, who are a tenderer. And they have details, scale SME. And so we've actually added this in already. I'm just going to remove it and pretend that we didn't, because I forgot to reset this before the demonstration. So we have this. Let's take a look at validating it using our data review tool. So let's upload it now. And we can see, hopefully, that it is valid OCDS data. Fantastic. So we know it's valid data, and let's confirm that we can see the parties within it, London Borough of Barnet and Cycle Lanes for You. Fantastic. So let's take a look at the party scale schema. It says we have details.scale using a string from party scale. Let's take a look at the documentation and see this in action. We have the details field and the scale field. So 9 times out of 10, you will be doing this automatically with your system using templates or pieces of software to generate your OCDS. For this demonstration, I'm just going to do it manually. So we have our release, we have our parties. Let's just hide this first party here because we don't need them. And then let's look here. Let's just insert these fields that we need. So we know it goes details, and it adds an object here. And then what was it called? It was called the scale. And then let's make it an SME just to follow the example. See my poor typing in action now. Let's save this file and then go back to the data review tool, load the new file. And then we can see here that the data review tool has picked up that this is an additional field. This is because we haven't declared the extension properly using the extensions array yet. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. We go back to our data, and then in the metadata, so before we get to releases at release level here, we have all of this metadata, so around publication policy, licensing, information about you as a publisher. And it's very straightforward. We add a field here called extensions, and it's actually an array. And then to actually declare the extension, we go to the extension on the Extensions Explorer, and we use this URL here. And you can click the button to just copy it to your clipboard in one fell swoop. And it will be a string, and we declare it here. We'll save the file. And then what we'll do now is we will re-upload it to the data review tool. And we can see here that the data review tool, being a tool that interprets OCDS data and knows how to use extensions, has now picked up that we're using the party scale schema extension. And then we can get a copy of the schema with extension patches applied if we need that for our own testing. And then we can use this field as it is part of the patched OCDS schema now. So going back to our slides, we've reached the end now. So I'm just going to give a quick summary that OCDS extensions document the structure, format, and wait 1 sec. I think Zoom's gotten in the way of itself. There we go, is that a bit better? OCDS extensions document the structure, format, and meaning of additional fields and codes. You can use extensions to publish data that isn't covered by the core OCDS schema and the core OCDS code lists. And you should be using the field level mapping template to identify which additional fields you can use that to map to fields in OCDS extensions, and the Extensions Explorer to find extensions, as well as documentation on how to use and implement them. You should be declaring extensions in the package metadata and validate extended data using the data review tool before you publish to ensure the highest possible quality. We've finished the webinar now, the main presentation. So I'm happy to take questions from the audience and give answers. You should definitely join the Open Contracting mailing list if you have sort of more advanced questions about implementing extensions. You should get in touch with the OCDS help desk. And before we're going to let you out today, we'd like you to fill out our post-event survey, just to sort of go, Matt, you're a rubbish teacher, or Matt, you're actually a pretty okay teacher, but I need to know a little bit more about extensions. This helps us to help you as an OCDS community going forward. So I will hand over the reins back to Andy to facilitate the questions and answers now, but I will keep my screen sharing this slide here.
All right, thank you so much, Matt. I think you did a good job of introducing what extensions are and how people can go about using them, because we actually got a couple of questions in our notes document. So Fantastic. I'll start with the questions in our notes document, and then we would open the floor for people to ask questions directly. So the first question comes from Adekunle from PPDC in Abuja, Nigeria. And his question is, how do we determine which section of the OCDS to extend? For example, publishing monitoring reports from field exercises and community engagement for a particular project. Which section of the OCDS should be extended to accommodate this data?
Yeah, fantastic question. So the first thing you should be doing is to determine whether that concept that you're describing has been modeled in an OCDS extension already. So the first step that I would do is to go to the Extensions Explorer, and then what were you trying to model there? What were some of the keywords there, Andy?
The keywords there were community engagement, monitoring reports from field exercises, and community engagement for a particular project. So I'm guessing there'll be some things that are peculiar to each community that they would like to capture.
Yeah, so looking at reports, we have performance failures. So that might be covering a concept very similar. You would have to explore that. But really what I'm trying to drive home is you should be, don't try and do everything yourself. There are some cases where you should be implementing your own OCDS extension. And in fact, we have an upcoming webinar which will detail how to do that. However, you should get in touch with the help desk to describe the problem that you're trying to model. Then we can give you advice on which existing extension might be applicable, and that just kind of removes the responsibility for you having to determine which section of the schema needs to be extended, because that will already be the rules for that extension will already be determined, and the sections for the schema will already be extended to cover that. And then if we determine that there is no extension that's applicable to you, then what will happen after that is we can walk you through the stages of developing your own extension, and that's when we can worry about whereabouts we in the schema that we extend it. I hope that answers your question. Is there another question? Hello, have I lost anyone?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize my mic was mute. Yes, there is a second question. I apologize for that. The question is, can you give us an example of open code lists versus closed code lists?
Oh, yeah, perfect. No problem at all. So the best way to find this is to head to the standard.opencontracting.org standard documentation. And then you can look at the reference, and then there is a page on code lists, and there are sections for open code lists and closed code lists. So an open code list, a good example of one actually is first, which is party role. So in a given procurement, there might be many different types of people or parties involved. You will have somebody who is a buyer whose budget is going to be used to pay. They may be the same or different to a procuring entity. You might have somebody who's inquiring, you might have a review body, or you might have something very specific. So I can't think of a specific example, but if there's something in your country or your legal jurisdiction that is a type of party, maybe a civic advocacy group who needs to monitor procurements in a particular space, then that isn't covered by the OCDS code list, then you can just add that in yourself. You should have it in like sort of this camel case style of text, but that's a case of an open code list where you can just like sort of, okay, well, this concept that I have doesn't quite fit with anything that I can see in this code list. So I'm just able to insert my own one, and then we can discuss about like sort of modeling it more formally later. An example of a closed code list would be a procurement category. So we take our procurement vocabulary from, I believe it might be the World Trading or something like that, or the UN. But we classify different procurements as being either goods works or services, and you can't classify a procurement in OCDS without using one of these. You can't add your own code list into that. So I hope that acts as a good example.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask questions, please. Let's see. I'll take silence to mean that there are no further questions. So at this point, I want to say thank you to everyone that joined today's webinar. And this is just like the start of our extension webinars. Like I mentioned in the invitation to this webinar, that we have a part 2 of the webinar specifically for people that are curious on how to create their own extensions. If say, some data that they're trying to capture is not available, is not covered in the existing OCDS fields. So I will drop a link to where you can get more detail on the...
Hello.
Okay, hi, Jeffrey. It seems, yes. You have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate this webinar. There's something I need to really understand. I've been trying to follow up on this, but what I realized is all about uploading procurement things electronically. And then maybe, I don't know, I've not explored a lot, but is this the first lecture about it, or it has been on?
No, good question. No, this isn't the first lecture. In August, we had a Getting Started with OCDS publication webinar. I can share that to you. If you drop your email in the notes document, I can personally send that to you. It's available on our YouTube channel, so I can share that directly with you. And then after that, we had a GitHub webinar to show people our OCDS community that's available on GitHub and what happens on there. And the extensions webinar, like we mentioned at the start of this one, is quite specific to people that have actually started their publication journey and have questions about using OCDS extensions and maybe creating their own extensions as well. So that's the purpose of this webinar. So you've kind of met us midway in a series of webinars, but thankfully we have them available on YouTube.
Okay. Then I would like to understand how I naturally translate this to practically apply into an organization setting, because tentatively I work with some NGO as an operations person, and I work in the context of procurement, fleet management, assets, and stores. So I would like to understand how I can possibly develop this to suit the organization's context of practice.
Okay, so primarily our publication happens primarily for government agencies that are the procurement agencies within a country. And typically what we see with NGOs is that NGOs look to monitor the services of the government, the procurement projects that governments are embarking on. That's how NGOs tend to use our OCDS data. But from the sound of it, you're talking about private procurement. It's what your organization is involved in.
Exactly.
So OCDS is not necessarily applicable to private procurement. It's targeted at government publishers. Then as an NGO, you can have monitoring the service delivery of the government.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello. So is there any other option that I can use to actually help within an NGO sector, or it's not possible?
It's a conversation that we can definitely have. If you send an email to our data team, our help desk team, we can see how we can help you move forward with your publication, your procurement publication goals.
Oh, thank you so much.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you, but we can't quite see. Okay, Shaibu Ali.
Exactly. I'm Shaib Ali from Jigar State Government. That is due process and project monitoring Bureau, Jigar State. Our government is intended for this wonderful development of OCDS.
Yes.
And now we are already engaged on this OCDS. We are starting publication it, but actually we need a capacity building of it may be a seminar or workshop which can give us a detail of how the OCDS is formed, because we are just a beginner for this year. We are starting publishing the contracts, that is publishing the award of contract and also the advert. And by God's grace, by the next year, we start doing our e-procurement, which we start from the beginning of the planning, publishing of the planning, advert, often tender and the award, and all the process will be in e-procurement. So we need at least some web or link which can help us to study very well, and we start doing it very well. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Taibo. So I know that your state has already written to our help desk about wanting to publish OCDS. I would like for you to please drop your details in our call notes so that we can reach out to you on how to organize a capacity building workshop specifically for your agency in Jigawa State.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, so please just drop your contact details in the call notes. Do you have the link to the call notes document?
No problem. I will send it to.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions for today? Okay, since we don't have any other questions, please, I am dropping the link to our post-event survey in the chat section. Please kindly take time out to fill this. It doesn't take longer than 3 minutes. We'd just like to hear from you on what you liked about today's webinar, what you'd like us to do more of, and how we can continue to help you as members of our OCDS community. All the resources that have been used in today's webinar will be sent to you via email, and this includes a video recording and audio recording, the call notes, a presentation as well, and a link to be a part of our OCDS community mailing list. Thank you all for your time today, and once you've completed the survey, you can exit from today's webinar. Thank you all, and do have a good day.